Hello and welcome to the Dublin Conversations, Catherine. Catherine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much for the conversation today. I'm very much looking forward to it. My name's Catherine Arrow, and I'm a public relations practitioner for many decades now. I'm based in New Zealand and I've been here for nearly 20 years. Prior to that, I was based in the UK, but I've been involved with global PR for many years through the Global Alliance for Public Relations and Communication Management. I was board secretary there for a number of years, and I've been actively involved in professional development and practitioner education again for many years. Going back in time, I launched the first training sessions for CIPR. It wasn't then, it was just IPR then, for the regions, and took things outside London, which hadn't happened at that stage. So my motivation for the work that I do is really to help people to understand the power of public relations, how it will help us to improve society and other undertakings that we together enact. And I hope that it will be an interesting conversation looking at some of the dimensions that you've got here in the Dublin Conversations.
Welcome there. Well, let's begin our journey then on what we call the 5 steps to Dublin. And step one, and I do appreciate you using a phone, so the screen must be very, very small to you, but I'll elaborate as best I can now. So our 5 steps start with a step 1, and it highlights that one of the most basic human functions after living, breathing, using your senses is this one about managing perceptions of future behaviours. And at the heart of that is this need to create confidence. Confidence, not in the sense of is used commonly as like self-confidence, but more in confidence meaning a reliable expectation of subsequent reality. So you need to have that reliable expectation of reality for yourself and for others and wider society. And there's 5 dimensions we believe to this confidence. And the first is really confidence in what you're perceiving as reality is a reliable expectation. Secondly, around your purpose, what is your role in your life and your purposefulness in how you help others. And thirdly, confidence that you need to earn the confidence of others to enable you to realise your purpose, and others need to have confidence in you. And fourthly, that you need to live in a world where other people have confidence in each other. And lastly, excuse me, what we call a zeitgeist confidence, where a confidence, say like business confidence or political confidence, a general mood of the times. And I know you've sort of talked in the past, Catherine, about the need for public relations being about potentially based on the idea of obtaining a social license, and that social license enables you to have effective relationships with other people. I just wonder if you want to sort of just elaborate a bit more on that point, and then look at how we then relate this to what we call step 1 of the Dublin Conversations, Dublin window here.
Yes, certainly. Well, I think fundamentally public relations is about building and maintaining the relationships that we need to keep our licence to operate. And that licence to operate can be political, it can be social, it can be economic, it can be environmental, but it's essentially the permission that we're given by others to do the things that we do. And if we're going to have an effective relationship, then that needs to have the components that have been identified over time by academics like Grunig and Hun. We've got trust, mutuality, satisfaction, commitment, loyalty. I add reputation in there, and that might touch on your mention of confidence, because without a good reputation, then people are either going to be reluctant to engage with you and build a relationship, and equally, if you have a good reputation, then they may decide that they feel that they can trust you. But I think the issue of confidence for the relationship might rest more with the elements of mutuality and trust. But if we think of the relationship having those components, I always think of it and describe it as an atom. So at the heart of what we do is a relationship with those components, but then supporting that, you've got the other elements of the atom and their communication, behaviour and understanding. And often with public relations, we have been caught in the communications element and add to that the written communication. But we need all forms of good communication for any relationship. So that's written, visual, oral and experiential. add to that the behaviours. How do we behave with our stakeholders? Do we behave ethically? Are we trustworthy in terms of living the values and the societal goods that we contribute as an organisation of any kind? And then the understanding element is around the knowledge and the narrative that comes into play in order to start the dialogue that's necessary for that conversation to begin and form the relationship that we hope will exist between our organisations and the people and communities that we serve. The relationship is about service more than anything else.
So it's fascinating, really emphasising there that people are social animals, and social animals don't just happen, but as you say, need this license to operate and exist. And I like that phrase about permission to operate. So suggestion here is that this step one, in fact, maybe not, doesn't contradict that at all, but rather deepens that, maybe highlighting some underpinning. So within the atom, forgive my lack of physics knowledge, but this might be like the neutron or whatever they are. But at the heart of how we operate and function as social animals is this idea that confidence also exists. Confidence is as in intrapersonal as well as interpersonal. That it's a story and that narrative within your own, within each of our own heads, as well as how we connect with others. And that confidence is really like the agency that enables the license to be created, the relationships to form and function. So I just wonder on this idea about confidence, that there's potentially a deeper, something that sits within the atom, to use your analogy, that is in operation here.
I think confidence plays a really important part in all elements of the atom, you know, all parts of it. I think for a relationship to form, fundamentally, it has to include trust. But where your notion of confidence, I think, comes in is being confident that you can trust, that it is a mutually beneficial relationship, that your satisfaction is, there's a point of confidence there where you can rely on the groups that you have. Sorry, I've just got alerts coming in on my phone because I'm having to do it
no.
on this method.
The joys of mobile technology.
So anyway, the confidence side of things, I think it contributes towards those other relationship elements, and building confidence takes the other parts of the atom, so excellence in communication, good behaviours, all of those things will be visible and then support the giving of confidence to an organisation through its communities of interest.
Just inspired me thinking there about Professor Jim McNamara's work on inputs, outputs and outcomes and so on. And I'm just wondering then, the elements of trust and the willingness for others to accept you, could they potentially be like outcomes from an input of this inner atom of confidence existing? That so the human function, as I say, is breathing, eating, using your senses, and creating confidence. I just wonder, any thoughts?
Well, again, Grunig and Hahn, when they put the various research papers out there, I think it would be back in a long time now, 20 years ago.
20, yeah, easy, yeah.
And their the measurement of trust paper, which I think you can still get through the American Institute of Public Relations, and it identified a methodology there of measuring those relationship outcomes. And for all areas of practice that I've operated in over the years, it's those fundamentals that are set up as the outcome to support the organisational strategy. So they're very much, your public relations outcome will be the improvement of trust, or it may be for a particular organisation that the focus needs to be on reputation. It may be that their values and behaviours need to be tested and improved. So all of those relationship components form agreed outcomes for a public relations strategy. And the other areas, the things that we do, help to bring that to life and move us towards the outcomes that will show that we've improved the relationship and that we've maintained our licence to operate.
Can I come back to outcomes in a moment? Because I think there may be some other dimensions that may give us some perspectives. Moving on to step two. And this is where we believe that if you need to connect with other people, you have 5 strategic choices, what we call opens choices. And you may recognize it originally rooted in the PESO model of paid, earned, shared, and owned, used in the public relations industry. But there's some fundamental difference in that they're not channels, but choices, strategic options you have to engage with others. And the profound difference is in the O of own, and it's not just own channels, but own behaviors, reputation, just being there, spending time with people can be a means of earning trust. And a further dimension of nudge, where, as I say, you can influence behaviors through what's known as choice architecture, making it easier for people to adopt the outcome you prefer. And that, using that, as I say, you can influence someone without actually directly communicating with them. So it opens up a bigger, wider arena. So I just want to, Catherine, any thoughts there about these 5 open choices reflecting the full range of options you have available to one?
Right. Well, 2 tricky things there. One is that I'm not, never have been a fan of the PESO model as it
Yeah.
relates to media relations, because it's one of those things that has been taken, I don't know, perhaps out of context and given ground to the wider purpose of what we do, when actually it's something that's related to a small tactical part.
Yeah.
And the other thing, in terms of nudge and the behavioural manipulation that's become quite popular over recent years and popularised by those units that existed in the UK government some time ago, I think that there's a lot of ethical question marks around that really need to be explored in detail. And I know that there are many practitioners out there that have taken this on as a tactical approach, but I still have some reservations as to the how, the why, and the where, and the when, as to its use and also its appropriateness. But I think in terms of the step that you were describing, the owned part of it, I think there's certainly some merit in exploring that further, because one of the dimensions of public relations practice that is often underexplored is the behaviour of organisations and communities of interest and activists and everybody else. A really marvellous colleague of mine over here, Tim Marshall, always talks about public relations operates where issues collide. And when issues collide, you have different behaviours that may in themselves appear to be good behaviours in context, but then set against another community of interest or a colliding interest, they obviously lose that appropriateness. So I think there's certainly room to explore, and I think there's some interesting points made in your step 2, but I suppose my antenna went off because of the link to the PESO model and also to the nudge, because helping people to change behaviours or improve situations is not a bad thing. In many instances, it's a good, but the difficulty with that kind of approach used as a blanket is that it will actually undermine people's identities that you were referring to. It will undermine their confidence, not just in themselves, but in some of the organisations and institutions that are necessary for society to operate.
Catherine, some fabulous insights there, and I love that phrase of when issues collide. So potentially then, as I say, I had 1 or 2 people comment about the association with PESO model. Certainly the objection there that need to be thinking strategically rather than tactically. So there may be some merit in the opens model, in that it elevates people's thinking from beyond tactics to strategy. And certainly the dimension of nudge, we're aware, and we've recorded various other different people with their reservations and even outright objections. The Dublin conversation takes a view that nudge is there whether we like it or not. But there is, as I say, valid concerns about its moral efficacy and use. To that end, we've produced a canvas to provide a stepping stone for practitioners in how to use it, but also carrying that health warning about its misuse. And in our fake purpose program, we identify among our 12 sort of negative behaviors, one of black dark nudge, which is misuse of a nudge for exploitation. So, for example, making it easier for people to gamble, and also a dark sludge where you deliberately make it harder to get someone to do an activity. So certainly, as I say, it's interesting your points there about echoing those concerns, and that maybe perhaps yes, there's a need for like maybe ethical controls, but also maybe a route whereby if you make people better consumers, more aware of what nudge is and alert to it, that may perhaps be the best route in providing protection against abuse of nudge.
I suppose the thing about that is that if it's just added in as another tactic, then it will be rolled out, and it will be rolled out primarily causing harm. Yeah. If you look at what we do and across all the fields that are incorporated into the Dublin conversations, because I know that it's not just public relations that your conversation stems from, but if your public relations activity and purpose is designed to improve a relationship, then manipulative behavior in the form of nudge or inverted commas behavioral economics is really not going to do that relationship any good at all, nor is it going to be a sound basis to have a relationship on. So there's a disparity between utilising that kind of behaviour and what we're actually trying to achieve. And in most cases, I personally feel it's wrong.
I think you've sparked some profound insight in that by having an integrated model of opens, those very negatives you highlight there will then be impact directly on the own. So that it highlights that anything you do is never done in isolation, that it's part of a wider fabric of interrelated dimensions, and possibly then, as you say, misuse of nudge, particularly as a tactical, particularly in an exploitative mode. The potential then is that then it would impact on your own, and therefore there may be potentially a corrective or part corrective mechanism this may offer in response to that, so that it empowers people to raise those objections and also provide some context and validity and rationale for those objections rather than just good, bad responses. As I say, I think some fascinating thoughts you've sparked there. So I've moved on to step 3 of our conversations, and this is a model developed by Professor Gareth Loudon of Imperial College London, and that we interact for a very, very simple process of listening, connect, doing. I've got a particular interest in the field of creativity, and this provides us a very wonderful, simple definition, explanation of the mechanics of how creativity and how we operate and how we interact with it. Listen, and you listen in your widest sense. You connect with things. You then do, which may be a development of a concept to an actual tangible action, but it's a continuous loop, listen, connect, do. And at the heart of that model is this idea of purpose, and the idea that the more stronger your sense of purpose, the more vibrant beating heart to keep this model going alive. And we're also really identifies the significance of what we call emergence, where our world is shaped not through design, but through what emerges from the environment. And one dimension to that is sociologists can now do experiments to establish almost the universal laws of human behavior, one of which is that 1 out of 3 people will help a stranger, which also means that 1 out of 3 don't. And that's not to make a moral judgment, but to highlight 2 primary instincts that provide parameters, a scope for different responses. And we've labeled those we-led thinking, where your instinct is to think of the collective, the whole, and me-led thinking, which is about self-interest. And obviously, context can play a big point in that if you're in urgent panic, people tend to be going to be me-led. But as a general instinct, as a general guidance, these provide perhaps the foundation stones for possibly 2 different philosophies in guiding how you create confidence, manage, use the opens choices, and potentially public relations, for example, could be seen as a we-led philosophy, that its instinct, its attitude is one of how does this affect on the wider community, the common good, as opposed to a me-led, which could be perhaps an advertising approach, which is about one of self-interest. So I just wonder, any thoughts, throwing a lot at you there, just wondering any thoughts about the listen, connect, do model and the ideas of we-led and me-led thinking there.
Well, I think the listen, connect, and do is fundamental to work that we do on a daily basis. We can't get anywhere if we don't listen. And it's not just listening, nodding twice, and then popping the results in a drawer. It's actually listening and endeavouring to understand, which is
Yeah.
where, going back to the atom, understanding plays its part in that whole listening process. I think from a relationship perspective, the tactics that we use allow us to connect, and hopefully the outcome is that improved relationship. I think I'd be interested to know more about the research that indicated the 2 out of 3 people
No.
helping. I suspect it's probably more like 2.5 people would help and half a person wouldn't, but I wouldn't know until I saw the data.
Well, it's a source of that is Nicholas Christakis in his book Blueprint. But yeah, I mean, and I love that of 2.5 as opposed to 2 there, sort of thing. So,
But it's the human inclination is to help. I mean, as you said, we are social creatures, we're social beings, and being social means interacting and helping one another wherever we can. I think for a large part, we saw that very visibly during the course of the pandemic in various parts of the world. There was very little me, apart from perhaps some politicians, and very much a we. How can we help each other? What can we do for each other? We'll go and check on you. We'll reach out. We'll do whatever it is we can. You see it in natural disasters. You see it in the immediate effects of climate change, which a lot of people around the world are seeing and experiencing on a daily basis. And from a communications perspective, I think advertising is often used now in terms of being a social marketing tool. So that may well also be we-led. I would like to think, and I would hope, that for the majority of practitioners, we-led behaviours would be in place and cemented by the codes of ethics that we adhere to when we are part of professional associations. And that's acting in the public interest, although, again, there are many publics, there's not just one. So in those interests for good societal good. So I'm not quite sure where you'd like to go with your step 3, but I think that there's certainly some commonalities there across the spectrum of activity that we undertake.
let's go to step 4 then. And this again is inspired by the work of behavioural psychologist Daniel Kahneman and others, who identified that we're emotionally driven animals, which then poses the question, well, how do you connect effectively with an emotionally driven animal? But we've identified 5 heuristics, rules of thumb, framed that if you do one or more, achieving successful in one or more of these, it's a route for effective social interaction. And those 5 heuristics consist of being known and noticed, so which aligns really with much of my career in public relations is about building awareness. Well, there's now validity for that. Secondly, about liking, and not in like Facebook likes or even just affective liking, but that can range from like respect and admiration, and even a paradoxical like where you may actively like to dislike someone. So think of some like shock jockeys or TV celebrities that go out their way to be controversial. The third area is earning trust. And the fourth is front of mind. So even though you may be well known, people are cognitive misers, lazy, and will tend to choose the immediately available option. And lastly, being talked about, social proof that I don't know what to think, but other people are saying this. And the Dublin Conversation believes that this known, like, trusted front of mind being framed about really shapes strategy of any campaign in terms of identifying what you need to be achieving to effectively social interact. So I just wonder, any thoughts there, Catherine, about those different elements, anything missing, or and this idea that perhaps it potentially could frame any strategy or campaign?
Well, I think in terms of programs and campaigns, you have to look first at whatever the organisational outcomes are
Yeah.
and to determine what they're seeking to achieve. And then you can look at your public relations outcomes and strategy. What do we need to do in terms of the improvement of the relationship? Do we need to build trust? Do we need to increase commitment? All of those things that we've mentioned. I think the problem that I can find or feel about the emotional connection and that provocation of feeling that you've highlighted there is that it's potentially you referenced it as a me-led approach. So it's not so much about the nature of the relationship, it's about the situation of organizational ego. And I think that that's not, that may be positioning an organization so that they can be seen, that people do know about them, but is it going to support their organizational purpose and outcomes? Or is it just going to give them a pleasant reflection in a mirror that they're holding up? And I think that maybe advertising's the mirror, and maybe public relations is the grim reality that we're all getting older and I'm not looking in the mirror at the same reflection as I was 20 years ago, you know? But there's an authenticity there and a reality there that you can't conjure. And I think if you look to behaviors that seek to just have somebody known or visible, you're going to lose that confidence that you spoke about at the beginning, because you're not going to be able to rely on the mirrors as necessarily being the accurate portrait of the organisation that's in that spotlight that's been created for them.
Is there a dimension there of then again emphasising the importance of listening? That is, as I say, it's a constant dynamic. So using the mirror analogy, it's therefore like, I don't know, it just prompts the idea that the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once wrote, a person never steps in the same, and you've just prompted a new metaphor here of someone never looks in the same mirror twice, perhaps. I don't know, but there's an ever-changing interaction of reflections and validity of one's social life and so on. So, and I think maybe like sort of the dynamics of the listen, connect, do, which I think is a factor I like about it, is that, as I say, it's a constant engine. It's never stationary, never still. It can go both positive and negative dimensions in things like trust and so on. There, but,
I think I'd just add on your listen, connect, and do. I think what's missing there is why. Okay, I used to, long time ago, write a column called "From the Hamster Cage," because when we're busy sending stuff out as practitioners, we're on that hamster cage all the time, and we can create as much stuff as you like to send out, but it doesn't necessarily achieve a great end for the work that we're putting in. And I think listen, connect, do is good, but it puts you back on the hamster cage unless you've got the why.
I think that's a brilliant observation. A suggestion I make is that step one of purpose, and purpose, as I say, identifies your why question. Why am I, like, it elaborates what you do, how you do, but fundamentally why. And as I say, so absolutely spot on there. And so the idea that purpose sits at the heart of that model and provides the agency for like the pedestal for why you're doing it, you know, so that we're revolving around here, and I love your analogy about the hamster cage, and that far too often people, you know, operating within a hamster cage world rather than a purpose and purposeful led world. I love that analogy, Kevin. So moving on into last step 5 is then about the idea that if you're effectively got a purpose, your story of why, you're effectively managing your 5 opens choices, you're effectively managing your listening, connect, doing, and managing the 5 goals. However, we need to think beyond that and develop this idea of comms and regenerative comms. In fact, remiss of me, I should have highlighted also under step 3 that the term comms has emerged as a label, and we believe that there's a need for a new a description of a bigger process, which potentially the Dublin 5-step is a candidate, and there's a need for a label for this candidate. And one option, we're keen to sort of distinguish between recognizing the need for a label and the actual label itself, as a candidate term of comms. And the word comms has emerged, but without any formal definition. And so there's a suggestion from the Dublin conversation that this could be a candidate label for describing a bigger world that is bigger than public relations, advertising, communication, behaviour change. We also believe should also include social cohesion and purpose. So I just want to, sorry, Catherine, remiss of me here, any thoughts you have about this label of comms, whether you like it, dislike it, use it or not use it at all?
I suppose my thinking would still go back to the relationship and the fact that communication, which is where comms has arisen and that abbreviation has been adopted over time, communication is absolutely essential to a great relationship, but it's not necessarily an end in itself in whatever forms it takes. So I think there would perhaps be a danger of limiting the scope of your intent by reducing it to an abbreviation of an existing term that's already supporting other functions. So, and I also think too that it takes a very Western view of the undertakings of public relations, and you'll find that there are very many different models and approaches around the world in different cultures and geographies where communication is very much a supportive role, and the personal interaction, personal relationship building is to the fore of any type of practice when both organisations and their communities, stakeholders of interest, are trying to forge those patterns of operation that allow them to work together and indeed build that social cohesion. I mean, lack of social cohesion is right up there in the 2-year top risk for this year's global risk report. And we're seeing that lack of cohesion and that fragmentation occurring globally. It's not necessarily a result of poor communication. It's a result of lack of trust. It's a result of dissatisfaction. It's a result of relationships not being mutually beneficial, being one-sided, or power imbalance existing. So I think that in terms of a wider conversation to attach a descriptor to all of the functions that you've talked about and the underpinning thinking behind it, I think it would have to have a wider cultural context than that which it's being given currently.
Fabulous insight there. Thank you for sharing that, Karen. So going forward now, step 5, there's a need for our model to recognise a regenerative dimension. At the moment, it's got a candidate label of regenerative comms, or it could be regenerative something else. But the idea that it goes a two-way communication model of like you seek to listen, engage, but recognises a third dimension that you operate and exist within a wider society, and there's a social fabric. And it's incumbent then really that in any social interaction, you seek to replenish that wider social fabric of trust, togetherness, and being able to come together to tackle the big issues. And so, as I say, there's this 5th step of a regenerative dimension to whether you call it comms or public relations or whatever other label may emerge. I just wonder, any thoughts there about this step 5?
The question of social fabric is a big one, and it's been a long day for me. I'm just
I apologise. Very early in the morning here. Apologies.
I think it's a really important question, and it needs a great deal of thought. One of the difficulties that we have across the world is the inequity that we find in society, and that's not going to improve with a quick comms fix. That has to look at the way we interact with each other as people. It needs to look at the structures that we have in place, the behaviours that are exhibited by leaders, the tone that's set, the willingness of all areas of society to engage, and for all areas of society to be engaged and allowed to be engaged and not discriminated against. So if you're talking about knitting social fabric together and giving it some long necessary repairs, it's not going to be easy to just darn those ragged edges together. What needs to be looked at are the fundamentals of human interaction and how we care for each other. So that, going back to one of your earlier steps, we're not in a me-led society. We are very much in a we-led society. So the thinking and the discussion and the conversation around that, I think you'll need to really get cracking on your 231 conversations. Have them from all walks and all avenues in life, because until we actually tackle the inequities, until we look to see how collectively we can improve our poor old planet and improve the way that we look after each other on that poor old planet, we're gonna there's a lot to do before you can tag regenerative anything over the top of that.
I think you've eloquently captured one of the Dublin conversation's prime driving force, that we face a world with massive challenges, and we pose the question: are people in the communications industries equipped with the right framework thinking, tools, and so on? How can we be fitter for purpose to rise to that challenge? So, as I say, this has been one effort to stimulate discussions, create this space for conversation, but critically also then emerging from it will be a positive contribution to making the world a better place in some ways, Catherine. So it's really, we've gone through the 5 steps now, Catherine, and how do you feel about having had this conversation and exploring these 5 steps about what does better look like? Do you feel more confident about addressing that question?
Well, I think it's a question that I look at every day in the work that I do with the organisations that I work with the practitioners that I'm hopefully encouraging to learn. What does better look like is something we have to challenge ourselves with from the minute we get up. So I think any conversation such as this is going to give some insights into that. And thank you for that conversation. And personally, I'll just carry on looking at what does better look like until hopefully we find something that works for all of the we-leds around the world.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and as I say, we celebrate convivial disagreement. And one point there is about: is there anything we should be doing different, do you think?
I think, having spoken with you today and looked at some of the materials that you were kind enough to share, I think perhaps my overriding observation would be that it is very Western focused. Yeah, it is looking through an initial lens of practice that has not been practiced in that way for some time in many places. So I think that would be an area that I would explore further through the different steps and lenses that you've put together.
So certainly one of the key action steps we need to be taking there. Anything else? Any other actions do you think the next steps we could be doing? Certainly after we've finished the recording, I'll be asking for any names of suggested contacts you can connect us with, or areas we need to look at. Anything else specific that comes to mind?
I can't think of anything specific at the moment, no.
Yeah, it's been a long day, and I appreciate it's very late for you in New Zealand, as my early in the day for me here. Catherine, I'll stop the recording there, but a massive thanks for taking part in the Dublin conversations, and also, as I say, it's been a fabulous, insightful conversation. I've certainly grown immensely as a result of the thinking there.